Hello everyone, I am Mitra from the Department of Earth Sciences, IISER, Kolkata. Today I am going to present to you our recently published work on the crustal structure and deformation of the Eastern Himalayan plate boundary system using broadband seismology. The big picture question that we ask is, how do plate boundary systems evolve? In order to elaborate on this, I use a map of continent-continent collision between Eurasia in the north and the other plates to the south. What you can see are plots of earthquakes of the last 50 years, which are shown as red circles. The moment you look at a map like this, what is remarkable is the difference in how the distribution of these earthquakes are in the oceans and in the continents. So you can clearly see in the oceans, these are in very narrow bands, defining very well the boundaries of the plates. Whereas when you come to the continents, you have a wide zone or a broad zone of distributed diffuse deformation. And also, if you looked at the style of deformation from the mechanisms of these earthquakes, you would see that it actually changes as you go across this wide zone. Next, what we are going to do is we will actually zoom into the region of our interest and look at this boxed region between India and Eurasia. This is the zone of continent-continent collision between the Indian and the Eurasian plate, which results in the formation of a fold thrust belt, a zone of intense deformation. In this case, it's the Himalayas which rise between the two plates. The continent-continent collision proceeds through on the thrusting of the Indian plate beneath the Himalayas and the Tibetan plateau and leads to propagation of strain, topography and crustal thickening away from the plate boundary zone, which you can see on the figure on your right, where you can see the Indian plate under thrusting beneath the Himalayas and the Tibetan plateau. A foreland basin system develops skirting the fold thrust belt due to the flexure of the downgoing plate, and the width of this foreland basin is determined by the elastic thickness of the flex plate. In this case, the width of the foreland basin south of the central Himalayas is about 200 kilometers. The collision is ongoing in the present day at a rate of 50 millimeters per year of shortening between India and Eurasia, and a third to a half of this is accommodated within the narrow belt of the Himalayas. If you take a cross section across the central Himalayas, where you have the blue line marked on the map, you would see that the interface between the downgoing Indian plate and the overriding Himalayan mountains is frictionally locked at the shallow depths, and this is where elastic strain builds up. This is a map plot of earthquakes which occurred in the last 50 years of magnitude greater than 5. These earthquakes are plotted as circles which are color coded by depth, with white being the shallowest ones and the orange being the deeper ones. The moment you look at a map like this, what is remarkable is the difference in the distribution of earthquakes in India and in Tibet. What you can clearly see is that as the Indian plate penetrates into Tibet, it undergoes very little deformation immediately south of the fold thrust belt, at least along the central part, which is shown by this blue box on the map, which you can also see from the plot of these earthquake epicenters, as I've pointed out. However, this simplistic picture does not really hold good for the entire Himalayan arc, and the most significant deviations occur around the two ends of this arc. I will be focusing on the northeastern end of this arc. It's almost a third of the Himalayan arc and has a significant influence on how strain is partitioned not only within the boundary but also away from the boundary, both to the north and south of it. Now let us take a closer look at this northeastern end of the Himalayan arc. This is the region which I refer to as the Eastern Himalayan plate boundary system. To the north you have the Eastern and the Sikkim Himalayas. This is followed by the Brahmaputra Valley, which is the foreland basin south of the Eastern Himalayas. To the south of the Brahmaputra Valley you have these elevated spurs of rocks in the Shillong Plateau and the Mikir Hills. And south of the Shillong Plateau is the Bengal Basin sediments, and to the east of it is the Indo-Burman plate boundary convergence zone. The most important faults in this region, which I'll be referring to throughout my presentation, are the Dauki fault, which bounds the Shillong Plateau to the south, the Oldham fault, which is a hidden fault somewhere in the north of the Shillong Plateau, between the Shillong Plateau and the Brahmaputra Valley, and the Kopili fault zone, which lies between the Shillong Plateau and the Mekir Hills. To the south of this, hidden underneath the sediments of the Bengal Basin, is the Eocene hinge zone, which is a gravity high, which most probably marks the paleo-continent ocean boundary between India and the Bengal Basin. From previous studies of the structure across the Shillong Plateau, the Brahmaputra Valley and the Eastern Himalayas, which is plotted onto your left, and from earthquake depth distribution across the Indo-Burman convergence zone, we now understand that this zone of the Eastern Himalayan plate boundary system is a zone of interaction between the under-thrusting Indian plate beneath the Himalayas and also of the subduction which is between the Indian plate and the Burman microplate. Now let me quickly tell you why the Eastern Himalayan plate boundary system is different than the Central Himalayas, or in other words, what are the significant deviations. The first one that we have already seen is that this is a region of wider zone of distributed deformation, which you can see from the earthquakes, and also you can see from the elevated Shillong Plateau, the southern boundary of which actually has a convergence which increases from the west to the east, known from recent GPS geodetic measurements. The next one is that the width of the foreland basin in this region is less than 50 kilometers. If you remember, in general, the width of the foreland basin south of the Central Himalayas was 200 kilometers, whereas it reduces significantly as you go eastward. In this region, there is a remarkable reduction in the thickness of sediments in the foreland basin. If you look at the region south of the Central Himalayas, the thickness of the foreland basin sediments is as large as 7 kilometers, whereas if you look at the Brahmaputra Valley, the thickness of the foreland basin sediments is less than half a kilometer. If you look at the Booger gravity anomaly map across this region, which is plotted on the left, you would see that the elevated Shillong Plateau is associated with a positive Booger gravity anomaly, which tells you that the positive elevation is not isostatically compensated by a crustal root underneath it. Therefore, it is important for us to develop models to explain these deviations, which essentially is fundamental to our understanding of continental tectonics across this region of the Eastern Himalayan plate boundary system. In order to develop such models, we need to address the following questions. The first one is, what is the crustal structure across this region and how does it vary laterally? The second one is, how is the Moho geometry across the northern and the southern margin of the Shillong Plateau and the Mekir Hills? Is it offset or is it flexed? The third one is, what is the variation in the sediment thickness in the Bengal Basin, and what is the nature of the crust which underlies the sediments? The fourth one is, what is the mechanism of the earthquakes in this region, and how are the relationship between the earthquake source mechanisms and the structure in this region? And the fifth one is, what is the role of the bounding structures, the ones which I had pointed out in the map previously, like the Oldham fault, the Dauki fault, the Kopili fault zone, and the Eocene hinge zone in accommodating the convergence. Once we have answers to these questions, what we can then do is we can combine it with the previous studies on GPS velocity field, the Bengal Basin tectonics, and the plateau uplift from low temperature geochemistry, so as to provide a kinematic model across this region. To study the velocity structure and earthquakes across this region, we are going to use broadband seismological data from a number of experiments which are listed on this plot here, and the stations which were deployed through these experiments are color-coded and plotted on the map. The first one is the Cambridge University, IIT Kharagpur and IISER Kolkata broadband stations. There are 11 of them across this region. The second one is the Bangla Pyre network for which we acquired data from the IRIS DMC. The third one is the Indian Meteorological Department stations. There are 5 of them, broadband stations, which are plotted as black triangles, and the fourth one are the stations which are operated by the Northeast Institute of Science and Technology, which are color-coded blue. The methodology that we adopt for estimating the structure has 2 parts. The first part uses the body waves, where we use the P wave and its coda to abstract information about the subsurface using a technique called receiver function analysis. These are basically sensitive to the impedance contrast boundaries beneath a particular station. Here is a schematic which explains the receiver function analysis technique. If you have an earthquake which is at the point which is marked as a source on the figure on the bottom left, and you have these energy which travels from the source to the receiver, and if you take a closer look at the receiver end and you see a stack of these layers and your energy comes in from the bottom, the P wave energy hits the boundary beneath a station, transmits as a P wave, and also converts to an S wave and reverberates within the layer. If we can actually use these transmitted and reverberating energy which are recorded by the station, we can then use their arrival times to model the structure underneath the station. To show you an example of these receiver functions, what you see on the top is the ray diagram for the transmitted and the converted and reverberating energy within a particular layer, which is marked as layer 1. So the corresponding receiver function is plotted at the bottom left. You will have a direct P arrival, which is the P arrival from the source to the receiver, which comes straight and transmits through the layer as a P wave. Then you will have a P to S converted energy, which is marked as a blue ray on the diagram on your top right, and this is marked as the PS arrival on the receiver function at the bottom left. And then you have the reverberations, which are multiple legs of P and ends up as an S wave. So what you can see on the bottom left is a time series. On your x-axis is time, which is marked in seconds. On your y-axis are the amplitude of these arrivals of the direct P wave, the P to S converted phase, which is marked as the PS, and then the reverberations. So what we do is we use the amplitude of these arrivals, which are sensitive to the impedance contrast boundaries, and the time offset between each of these arrivals are actually controlled by the thickness of the layer, given that we know what the velocity is. So we can use these 2 information to actually look at the geometry of the moho and also to estimate the thickness of the layer and the VPVS ratio within this layer. The earthquakes that we use for our receiver function analysis are teleseismic earthquakes, which lie in an epicentral distance range of 30 to 90 degrees. For a central Shillong Plateau station, all the earthquakes that we have used are plotted on the figure on your right bottom. The red stars are all the earthquakes, and these are recorded at a station which is marked by the blue square in the middle. We show the example of receiver functions calculated for the central Shillong Plateau station SHLG. What you see on your left are the receiver functions for all the earthquakes which are plotted on the right. What you clearly see in a plot on the left is the direct P wave arrival, and then you have the P to S converted phase, which is marked by the red line, and the reverberations, which are marked by the blue and the green lines. So these essentially are receiver functions computed for each earthquake, which are now plotted as a function of ray parameter, which is basically the distance from the station. We will use these receiver functions recorded at pairs of stations across the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau and the Mikir Hills, and also across the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau, to see if there is any variation in the receiver functions, which will then give us an understanding of what the geometry of the moho is underneath these regions. In order to do this, we will use the receiver functions from their piercing points on the moho, which are plotted by the plus signs which are color coded by the station. So what I am showing you on this map is the receiver function piercing points on the Moho for every station along the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau and the Mikir Hills and the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau. Remember that these rays are inclined to the vertical, and therefore they do not come in and hit the station vertically underneath the station, but at an angle which is inclined to the vertical, and therefore it samples a conical region which is shown by the schematic on the bottom left. And that's why you have all these distribution of piercing points around the station. Therefore, what it allows us to do is to abstract the three-dimensional nature of the structure underneath every station. So we'll start by looking at the pair of stations Tejpur marked as TEZ and Borjuri BORJ, which is across the northern edge of the Mikir Hills. We look at the receiver functions from north to south and see if there is any variation in the converted and the reverberating phases, which will then give us a handle on the variation in the structure, most importantly the geometry of the Moho as we go from north to south. In the map at the center, we have actually zoomed into that region between Tejpur and Borjuri, and what you can see as the plus signs color coded in red are the ones which are receiver function piercing points for the station Tejpur, and the ones in blue are for the station Borjuri. What you can see on the right panel are the receiver functions going from north to south, and you can clearly see that the Moho PS phase is offset by about a second. Now, receiver function PS phase offset by every second from the direct P arrival results in a crustal thickness approximately of 8 kilometers. So if you have an offset from 4 seconds to 5 seconds, that means that there is a variation in the thickness of the crust by 8 kilometers, or there is a change in the depth to the Moho by 8 kilometers across this region. And you can see from the plot on the right that this variation happens somewhere in between the Tejpur and the Borjuri stations. Now we look at a set of stations across the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau. We'll be looking at 3 stations by Hata, Guwahati and Nongpo, and look at the variation in the receiver function PS phase from north to south. So again, the plot in the middle is a zoomed in version of the plot that you see on the left, where you can see the 3 stations by Hata, Guwahati and Nongpo. The piercing points are color coded: red for Baihata, black for Guwahati and blue for Nongpo. On the right panel are the receiver functions from all of these stations going from north to south, and again you see a very similar feature. The Moho PS phase is offset by a second, so it's at 4 seconds to the south and 5 seconds to the north, which essentially means that the change in crustal thickness is about 8 kilometers, or the change in the depth to the Moho is about 8 kilometers across the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau. Next, we look at the western end of the Shillong Plateau across the northern edge between stations Dhubri and Tura. We will again look at receiver functions going from north to south and see what kind of a variation do we see in the converted and the reverberating phases. On the right panel, you have the receiver functions plotted for the stations Tura and Dhubri. Here what you can see is that the variation is not as distinct as you had seen across the northern edge of the plateau in the center or across the Mikir Hills and the Brahmaputra Valley. Here the variation is between 4.5 and 5 seconds, and therefore you have a change in the thickness of the crust or the depth to the Moho, which is somewhere around 4 kilometers. We now focus across the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau, and we will be looking at piercing points of receiver functions recorded at a station Cherrapunji, which is at the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau, and we'll look at receiver functions which are to the north and to the south of the stations to see if there is any variation in the converted phases of these receiver functions as we go from north to south. The receiver functions which are plotted on the rightmost panel actually show a remarkable difference between those which arrive from earthquakes to the north and those which arrive from earthquakes to the south, you can clearly see that the Moho PS phase is at 5 seconds underneath the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau and is about 6.5 seconds for the ones which are sampling through the Bengal Basin. Therefore, you have a clear offset of 1.5 seconds, which is approximately a 12-kilometer change in thickness of the crust or depth to the Moho across the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau. Now let me come to the second part of the methodology, which is using surface wave information. So what we do is we compute group and phase velocity dispersion information from the surface waves, and these are sensitive to the vertical averages of shear wave velocity. We combine these group velocities along the source receiver path into a tomographic formulation and then abstract information about the group velocity dispersion corresponding to a particular station, and then we combine it along with the receiver functions to model the shear wave velocity structure underneath the station. We perform a joint inversion of the receiver functions along with the group velocity dispersion data, and this has an advantage of actually complementing each other. So the receiver functions are sensitive to the impedance contrast boundaries, and the group velocity dispersion is sensitive to the vertical averages of shear wave velocity. Therefore, we get information of both the velocity and the impedance contrast boundaries by jointly inverting the two data sets, which gives us the shear wave velocity structure underneath every station. This is an example of the joint inversion of receiver function and dispersion data. What you see plotted on the bottom left is the receiver function observation as the black dashed line. On the top left is the observed dispersion data bounds plotted as the black vertical lines, and the velocity model for the joint inversion is plotted on the right. We start from two different starting models plotted as dashed lines in gray, which is the mantle half space, and the black one, which is from the thickness versus VPVS ratio calculation. We end up with velocity models which are plotted as blue and red. The blue one is the thinly parameterized velocity model, and the corresponding synthetic receiver function and dispersion data is plotted as blue curves. And then we thickly parameterize this velocity model, which is the red line plotted on the right, and also the corresponding synthetics are plotted as red curves. So you can clearly see for the central Shillong Plateau station Shillong, we have a two-layer crust with the upper crust 12 kilometers thick, the lower crust which goes up to a depth of 31 kilometers. The Moho is at a depth of 31 kilometers, and the total crustal thickness is 31 kilometers with an upper mantle velocity which is about 4.3 kilometers per second. I'm going to present to you the velocity structure going from north to south. This is a plot of the shear wave velocity structure for stations in the Brahmaputra Valley. There are three panels on the top which are velocity structure for stations Baihata, north of Guwahati, and Tejpur. What is important to observe in these velocity models is the average velocity in the crust, which is about 3.5 kilometers per second for all the three velocity models, and the thickness of the crust, which is 40 plus minus 2 kilometers. These are velocity models for the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau. What you can see across all these four panels is that the average velocity of the crust is 3.5 kilometers per second, same as we observe beneath the Brahmaputra Valley, and the crustal thickness beneath these stations reduces from 40 kilometers beneath the Brahmaputra Valley to being 33 plus minus 2 and 31 plus minus 2 as you go from the west to the east. So beneath the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau, there is a significant decrease in the crustal thickness, although the crustal VS remains the same. Next are the stations in the central Shillong Plateau and in the Mekir Hills. What you can see here again in the panels on your top is that the shear wave velocity in the crust is the same as before. It's 3.5 kilometers per second, and the thickness of the crust is about 31 kilometers plus minus 2 underneath the Shillong Plateau and about 30 kilometers beneath the Mekir Hills. So again, it's quite similar to what you saw at the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau, and it's much thinner than the Brahmaputra Valley. Moving on to the western edge of the Shillong Plateau, the shear wave velocity in the crust is the same as before. It's 3.5 kilometers per second, whereas the thickness of the crust is slightly larger than what we saw in the central Shillong Plateau. So this is about 36 plus minus 2 kilometers at the western edge of the Shillong Plateau. Summarizing the receiver function and joint inversion results, what we see across the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau is that there is a clear change in thickness of the crust and the depth to the moho by 9 to 10 kilometers north of the central Shillong Plateau and the Mekir Hills, and this dies off as you go towards the western Shillong Plateau edge and becomes 2 to 4 kilometers. What you can clearly see is that the crust across this entire region has an average velocity of 3.5 kilometers per second, which essentially corresponds to continental crustal velocities. So you have continental crust underlying the Shillong Plateau and the Brahmaputra Valley, and there is most probably either a fault offset or a very strong flexure across the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau, where you have a change in thickness of the crust from about 31 kilometers in the central Shillong Plateau to about 40 kilometers in the Brahmaputra Valley. Let us now look at the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau, where we use receiver function modeling from the station Cherrapunji. So for those receiver functions which are sampling the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau, what we see is that the crustal thickness underneath this region is about 35 plus minus 2 kilometers. Looking at the receiver functions from the south, which samples underneath the Bengal Basin, we can clearly see that the thickness of the crust dramatically changes to about 48 plus minus 2 kilometers for these receiver functions. I will rotate the map in order to actually look at the variation across the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau. So the map that you see at the bottom is pointing to the north towards your right, and on top I have 4 panels, 2 of them which are actually for receiver function joint modeling with dispersion data from the Bengal Basin, and the ones to the right, 2 of them are for the Shillong Plateau. I will compare the velocity structure across the southern edge by looking across these 4 panels. On top of these velocity models, I have now marked out where the moho is and where the crust and the sediment layer is. So what you can clearly see is that there is a moho offset going from 35 kilometers beneath the southern Shillong Plateau to about 48 kilometers underneath the Bengal Basin. You can clearly see that the 2-layer crust underneath the Shillong Plateau is also present underneath the Bengal Basin. However, it's stacked with a very thick layer of sediments on top of it, which has very low velocities, lower than about 3 kilometers per second. So these are the sedimentary layers which has a thickness of as large as 18 kilometers sitting on top of the 2-layer crust, which is most probably offset underneath the Bengal Basin. Now I add the summary from the southern edge onto the same map as before. So what you see across the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau is an offset on the moho by about 12 to 13 kilometers. Next, I will move on and look at the structure underneath the Bengal Basin for 2 stations, Agartala AGT and Bello in the south. This is a plot of the velocity structure for those 2 stations AGT and BELO. You can see on the top panel the 3 velocity models. What you see is the remarkable difference in the crustal structure. Here the crust is only 18 to 20 kilometers thick with a shear wave velocity of 4 kilometers per second. We call this as a transitional crust because in thickness it is intermediate between a 35 kilometer thick continental crust and a 7 kilometer thin oceanic crust, and also intermediate in velocity between the 3.5 kilometers per second that we saw for the continental crust and about 4.1 that we see in the oceanic crust. So this crust, this transitional crust, is overlain by that thick pile of sediments that we have seen further to the north as well, which is about 18 to 20 kilometers thick. Now the question that we ask is, where is the transition between the downfaulted continental crust that we saw south of the Shillong Plateau and this transitional crust that we see in the Bengal Basin? The answer to that question can be found in the velocity structure across the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau. What I am showing you here are the velocity structure for the stations on the Shillong Plateau, Cherrapunji, which is looking both north and south, and the station which is in the Bengal Basin, SUST. So you can clearly see that the crust across the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau is down faulted, which you see from Cherrapunji north and south receiver function inverted velocity structure. Then as you go across from the Cherrapunji south at the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau into the Bengal Basin underneath the station SUST, you can see that the crust becomes transitional with a thickness of about 20 kilometers, and the sediment that you see on top is about 18 to 20 kilometers thick. So the transition from the down faulted continental crust south of the Shillong Plateau into the transitional crust which you see underneath the Bengal Basin lies somewhere south of the Shillong Plateau. There are two ways in which we can actually explore this change in the crustal structure from continental material underneath the Brahmaputra Valley and the Shillong Plateau and transitional material underneath the Bengal Basin. The first is by looking at the thickness of the sediments and its variation as you go from the north to the south. This is a plot of the sediment thicknesses. The way we demarcate the sediments is by using an average Vs of 3 kilometers per second. So any layer which has an average Vs of 3 kilometers per second is what we mark as the sediment or the sedimentary layer. So you can clearly see that the sedimentary layer or the thickness of the sedimentary layer is between 0 to 1.5 kilometers underneath the Brahmaputra Valley and the Shillong Plateau. However, as you go south of the Shillong Plateau, there is a remarkable change in the sedimentary layer thickness, which is about 12 to 14 kilometers immediately south of the Shillong Plateau, and then increases to about 20 to 22 kilometers in the Bengal Basin. The next is the observation of the thickness of the basement layer and its variation from north to south. So what you can clearly see is that the basement thickness or the crustal layer thickness without the sediments is about 40 kilometers underneath the Brahmaputra Valley. It's about 30 to 31 kilometers beneath the central Shillong Plateau and about 34 to 35 kilometers the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau. All of these has an average Vs of 3.5 kilometers per second. As you go off the southern edge of the Shillong Plateau, the thickness of the basement layer or the crust without the sediments is about 20 to 22 kilometers immediately south of the Shillong Plateau in the northern Bengal Basin, and then reduces to about 16 to 18 kilometers in the southern Bengal Basin. This basement layer has an average velocity of 4 kilometers per second. So you can clearly see that there is a change in terms of the shear wave velocity and the thickness of the crustal layer without the sediments as you go from the Shillong Plateau into the Brahmaputra Valley, and also as you go from the Shillong Plateau into the Bengal Basin to the south of it. Summarizing all of these results, we can see that there is continental crust underneath the Shillong Plateau and the Brahmaputra Valley, which has a shear wave velocity of 3.5 kilometers per second. Across the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau, there is a strong flexure or possible offset on the Moho going from about 30 kilometers to about 40 kilometers. So there is an offset of about 9 to 10 kilometers across the northern edge. However, we cannot completely ascertain if it's an offset or if it's a flexure. However, what we clearly see is that the velocity of the crust in the Brahmaputra Valley and the Shillong Plateau is 3.5 kilometers per second and is of continental nature. Across the southern edge of the plateau, which is across the Dauki fault, where you see the Shillong Plateau stand at an elevation of about 1 kilometers over the Bengal Basin, you can clearly see an offset in the crust, and this offset in the crustal thickness, on the Moho is about 12 to 13 kilometers. What is remarkable is the velocity and the thickness of the crust underneath the Bengal Basin. It's a transitional crust with a thickness of about 18 to 20 kilometers with a velocity of 4 kilometers per second, and this is overlain by sedimentary layers and sedimentary rocks which are as thick as 18 to 22 kilometers and has a shear wave velocity of about 3 kilometers per second. Finally, I'm going to look at a cross section across this region going from north to south, which is marked by the blue line, and I'm going to actually project receiver functions or the structure across this region in the yellow box around this blue line. These are the plots of the cross section. On top, what you see is the common conversion point stack of receiver functions. On your left is south, on your right is north. It goes across the Shillong Plateau. The topography is plotted on top. What you see as red is the positive conversion from receiver functions, and in blue are the negative conversions from the receiver function. So you can clearly see that across the Dauki fault there is a clear offset in the crustal thickness, and to the north of the Shillong Plateau there is a very strong flexure. There could possibly be an offset, but it's not very clear from the receiver functions. So what we can absolutely clearly see is the offset in the crustal thickness across the southern edge of the plateau and a strong flexure across the northern edge of the Shillong Plateau. The schematic which has been plotted out of the CCP from receiver functions is plotted at the bottom. So you can see that underneath the Shillong Plateau the crust is the thinnest. It's about 30 kilometers. North of the Shillong Plateau into the Brahmaputra Valley, the moor is strongly flexed and the crustal thickness is about 40 kilometers. The crust is of continental nature across this entire region with a shear wave velocity of 3.5 kilometers per second. Across the Dauki fault to the south, you can see that the Shillong Plateau crust is down faulted and its continental crust immediately south of the Shillong Plateau in the northern Bengal basin, and then progressively thins to a transitional crust with a shear wave velocity of 4 kilometers per second. And this transitional crust is overlain by the thickest pile of sediments, which is about 20 kilometers thick in the Bengal basin. So this summarizes the structure across this region going from the foreland basin, which is the Brahmaputra Valley, to the Shillong Plateau, which is this uplifted piece of rock sitting within the foreland basin of the Himalayas, and then into the Bengal basin where you have transitional crust going from continental towards oceanic in the Bay of Bengal and is overlain by the thickest pile of sediments in the Bengal basin. This work has been published in JGR Solid Earth, and I acknowledge my co-authors. In the next movie, I'm actually going to present to you the earthquakes vis-a-vis the structure, and we'll try and solve the kinematics in this region. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. If you have any questions, you are free to write to me at shupriyomitra@iisercol.ac.in. Thank you very much.